The sun had already learned to sit heavy over Lagos by the time Jacob noticed the car. It smoked like a slow animal at the roadside, its bonnet up to the sky, a fine red dust settling on the chrome like a scolding. He wiped his hands on the rag tied to his belt, oil black against the sweat on his palms, and felt for the socket he had borrowed from a mate that morning. The workshop behind him smelled of petrol and iron, of old bread and the faint ghost of exhaust. Children chased a ball near the drain. Mariam would be waiting with the kettle on. Helen would be finishing her homework at the table under the single bulb. There were bills to meet, school fees to scrape together, and small humiliations that scraped at his pride like sandpaper. He liked to tell himself that work kept those down. Pride took other shapes. The steadiness of his hands, the way he arranged tools, the respect he could still call from neighbors who had watched him grow from apprentice to man. It would not feed Helen, though. The driver sat inside the car, embarrassed, muttering into a phone. He had a sweater tied around his shoulders despite the heat. The man glanced up when Jacob crouched and offered a hand. "Battery gone," the man said, but he was younger than Jacob had expected and not the sort who would know a battery from a biscuit. He had the kind of Naira bill guess in his pocket that meant someone else paid for his time. "She needs a tow?" Jacob asked. His English carried the industry of the yard. People here used words like tools and time like currency. No, just—" the man hesitated. "Take a look, Baba." Jacob climbed, fingers finding bolts like old friends. A crowd gathered, as they always did. Lagos loved a stoppage on the road. She stepped down from the shade of the car with a grace that made the crowd part politely, the way waves part around a rock. Amanda moved through heat like someone who had spent winters indoors, a pale calm in a city that pressed and pushed. She wore sunglasses, not the theatrical kind, but one that announced a privacy the town had to respect. Her heels sank a little in the sand. The soles had that clean click which never belonged to a man who repaired engines. "Is it much?" she asked, in a voice used to being answered. She had the voice of someone who had bought answers for decades, efficient, softened at the edges by repeated goodwill. Her face was lined, not with anger, but with a patience that had been practiced like a prayer. She was 65. The years showed like fine embroidery rather than erosion. Jacob found himself speaking differently in front of her, softer, as if the oil on his hands would offend marble. He told her gently that it might be the battery, that he could try to get it going. He did not say he could not afford to let the day slip, that his daughter needed shoes, that Mariam had eaten cassava for 3 nights hoping to spare 1 meal of rice for Helen. She watched his hands work, and something like approval loosened inside her. "Please," she said, "I'm in a hurry. There's a meeting." He listened to the rhythm of her life and felt how far 2 lives could be in the same city. He understood the geometry of her distance, a mansion somewhere in Victoria Island, security men with clipped manners, doors that opened without needing hands on them. He understood how the city was stitched together by invisible threads of access. He had been proud then, proud to offer a fix, proud to be useful. She slipped him an envelope before she left, a thick one, crisp Naira notes that smelled faintly of perfume. He almost refused. "You don't take alms from strangers, not in front of your neighbors." He took it with a nod because there was a child at home and prizes to pay for, and because his pride, for once, could be bought cheap. After that first afternoon, the visits became routines that smelled of petrol and jasmine. Amanda asked him to check her car, then the generator, then the faulty tap in the guest bathroom. Gifts arrived in predictable arcs, an envelope discreetly tucked inside the engine cover, a box of rice left at his doorstep. People in the neighborhood talked in low murmurs, gossip that was neither harsh nor compassionate, merely observant. Jacob told himself these were kind gestures for a good mechanic. Mariam told herself nothing. She would watch the way his clothes began to look less threadbare, how his son's shoes stopped having holes, then she would tighten her mouth and say nothing. They were careful for a while. Secrets in Lagos have a short breath. They rarely last a full day. But late nights stretch the space between shame and habit. Amanda was lonely in ways the money could not touch, a fact she was as aware of as anyone. She had built an empire of logistics and cold decisions. Her board meetings ended, and the house was vast and soft and eerily quiet. She saw in Jacob a kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with the currency in his pocket. He came to her house with a rag on his belt and took to fixing the things in her life that were broken in ways neither of them could talk about clearly. He did not grovel, he did not flatter. He bent, and his hands thanked the world for the work. Jacob told himself he could stop. He told himself he would not put Mariam's patience to the test. But promises bend like leaking roofs. The rain finds the seam. He began to come to the mansion at odd hours. He began to think of marble as too loud, and the hush of the corridors as some kind of soft religion. He began to tell himself stories he had never allowed, that Providence sometimes wore a woman's face, that being loved by wealth was a form of being seen. He told himself, too, that what they were doing had no name that required confessing. Mariam was not a woman to be hoodwinked. She carried a dignity like a purse she never opened. She saw the envelopes and the new shirt, and the sudden smoothness at the corners of argument that had once burned between them. She had married Jacob for fortitude, for the way he could stretch food into a meal, and silence into a future. She had followed him with faith. She kept the past like a lantern to warm herself by. When the whisper grew into a shape, she sharpened. "You cannot keep carrying their shadows into our home," she said one night, washing a pot with a rhythm that was a prayer and a code. Helen slept in the house that breathed through old boards and a single fan that never quite cooled. The air smelled of stew, and the dampness caught on the walls like unfinished business. Jacob tried to explain. He tried to reach for the dignity of honesty. "She helps," he said. He stopped because the truth was a slippery thing. Saying she helped cheapened what had happened. Saying we encountered something made it sound like accident. He lied, which is another kind of survival. When the hospital called Amanda's name, it was first as a curiosity. She went for a routine test, a slight irregularity in her body that her doctor wanted to look after. At 65, the idea of pregnancy carries the same shock in a room as a thunderclap. The nurse's face smoothed into a professional neutrality, but Amanda recognized the shape of surprise she had seen on others' faces when they learned they had been wrong about probability. The doctor said words like rare, unexpected, could be a false positive, as though the language would make it less true. But there are things whose reality is not softened by cautious sentences. The scan wavered on the screen like an uncertain moon. Her hands shook when she called Jacob. She offered him no money then. She offered him the news as if it were a thing they could share only quietly. "I am pregnant." Jacob heard the word as a drop in his chest, and as a possible tide. He listened to the spaces between her sentences, the way she laughed at herself once, a brittle sound. He was positioned between two shoals, the moral reefs of his marriage and the deep ocean of Amanda's loneliness. He wanted to be helpful. He wanted to be loved. He wanted to do something to sleep at night. When Mariam confronted him, she did not shout so much as thread accusation into a needle. "You have been selling us to someone else," she said. "You have been letting us sleep hungry with your hands full of other people's bread." "You think I like it?" Jacob pleaded. He thought of Helen and the way her teeth looked when she smiled, her small hands gnarled like roots from too much play in the drain water. He thought of Mariam's hands, the scar on her wrist from when she fell carrying a bucket years ago. He thought of how little there was left to protect them besides his own stubbornness. Mariam found other means of protection. She watched Amanda from the corner of her life and felt something sour that was not exactly anger and not exactly fear. Amaka, Amanda's twin, noticed first the new attention and misread its arithmetic. Twins have complicated economies of loyalty. Amaka had lived for decades in the shade of her sister's accomplishment. She had run errands and signed checks and lived on the crumbs of influence because the crumbs were consistent. When crumbs begin to thin, hunger discovers revolutionary plans. Amaka's dependence had hardened into entitlement. Where Amanda saw companionship, Amaka saw a slipping of control. She feared the mansion would one day be legitimately hers, and instead found herself bargaining with the shape of a new problem: a woman pregnant at 65, a mechanic with oil still on his fingers prowling the corridors, a niece or nephew that might carry a name and not the family's money. Her sons, Emma and Chisholm, paced the house with a half pride and a half question. They were not bad men. They were products of an expectation that wealth would secure them. They watched the way servants shifted their eyes and thought the world was short of sense. It was Amaka who suggested small things at first: a forgotten bottle in the pantry left a day too long, a tray of food sent to Amanda with a note about old allergies. She played on fear, not cruelty. Fear that the future she had imagined would not exist. Fear is fertile soil. It roots quickly in people who have reason to protect what they have lost before. Amanda, when she discovered the first disturbances, treated them as nuisances. She was used to problems being solved without asking too many questions. A manager could be pulled aside and asked to explain. A guard could be reassigned. But she could not call a board meeting to convene against intrigue in her own family. The staff were mirrors. They would tell employers what they wanted to hear. The more she tried to listen, the more the truth slipped into corners. Jacob, meanwhile, felt the city tighten like a fist around his family. The money was a salve that did not settle. He knew the gossip would come to the compound. Whispers of the mechanic seen in the marble foyer, of a woman in sunglasses leaving notes on the car. Mariam's face grew paler, not with sickness, but with the slow erosion of dignity. One night, after a particularly sharp argument, Jacob left the house and walked until his feet ached. The heat clung to his skin, and the neon hummed at intersections like an accusation. He knew he had to choose. He sat on a curb and met himself in the reflection of a puddle. He was not a bad man, he told himself. He was a man who had made small compromises to feed a girl's school fees. Compromise, once tasted, was not always shameful. Sometimes it was survival. Amanda's pregnancy became a public access. Her announcement to a close circle of friends was elegant and staggered the room. It carried a murmured reverence and a careful word. She would raise this child. She did not speak of the father in public. People speculated. The newspapers, where gossip had markets of its own, whispered with a courtesy that suggested a deference to her stature. But in private, the gossip was a blade. It cut and then left the wound to show. When the attempt happened, it was small enough to be plausible and large enough to be true. The household staff noticed Amanda's unease, the way she flinched at a cup offered, the way her tea tasted off that afternoon, a bitterness that had nothing to do with the leaves. She retreated, and the house went into a shell of procedure. The doctor urged caution, and Amanda realized she was no longer just a woman at a table. She was something fragile that had to be guarded. Amaka's face was impeccably sad. She swore she had nothing to do with it. But a house has many channels, and a sister who long remembered favors owed kept accounts in a ledger that had more than numbers. Jacob heard about the incident from a friend who worked as a driver at the compound. The word attempt carried in the gossip like a slow poison. He pictured Amanda in a small room, white sheets clinical and hushed, and felt a guilt that was not clearly his and not clearly not his. He thought of Helen and of Mariam, and the scales of right and wrong swayed under his feet. He wanted to help in the only currency he knew: presence. The revelation of the plot did not land like a lightning bolt. It arrived like a long, slow winter. Amanda's anger was not theatrical. She collected evidence the way she did balance sheets, precise and cold. It was one thing to lose money. It was another to have your person violated. She did not scream. She stood in the library where her life's books smelled of dust and leather, and announced that whoever had wanted to harm her will be found. Amaka fretted and pleaded. "Sister, think of the scandal," she said, her voice grown small and swift, the way an animal might try to charm a predator into gentleness. "We are family. We cannot be broken." Amaka looked at her as if she were seeing a version of the woman she was, and also not. "Family does not attempt to kill," Amanda said. The words slid through the room like ice. The household held a meeting. It was meant to be private and efficient. Security men sat at the periphery with a posture like carved wood. Amanda's disposition was not vindictive. It was a steel with a soft edge. She dismissed Amaka from the house. The decision had layers: legal, personal, financial. Amaka's sons were to leave as well, their allowances cut and their privileges revoked. The family compound that had once been a net of obligations zipped into a hard seam. Amaka left with her sons, and her anger shaped into a plan none of them would yet voice aloud. She told herself she would not beg, even though begging had been her currency. She left with a truck of things and a pocketful of resentment. The street watched as one woman's exit became another woman's survival story. There are, in Lagos, many kinds of exiles. Jacob watched this unspooling with a complicated lightness. He told himself that this was justice. He told himself it was right that someone who had tried to harm another should be exiled. But then he learned something else that remade the world. Amaka, in the privacy of anger, had implicated him indirectly. She had spoken to friends. She had held at the edges the idea that the mechanic was the one who brought Amanda into the net of vulnerability. People translated that idea into the language of blame. The poor man who had stolen a rich woman's privacy. Mariam went into the crisis as any woman would, protective and quick with accusation. "You have brought this to our doorstep," Mariam hissed, not as a plea, but as a verdict. Jacob did not protest with the vigor of innocence. He had been and was complicit. He had been intimate in a way that left home. He had let a woman into spaces he should have kept closed for the sake of a child. He had done it in the fog of need. But he had not intended violence, had not intended to harm Amanda, had not intended to fracture a family like a misthrown stone. The accusation gnawed at him. He felt stripped, not of possession, but of the illusions that kept him steady, that his choices were small and reversible, that he could vanquish consequences with a few well-placed naira. The pressure mounted until Jacob could not stand it. One night, after a conversation that had become a legal scrawl between them, threats of police, hints of stories to the press, the pulse of money in talk, he woke to find Helen's school bag on the floor, a note from the head teacher about fees. Mariam had sat up all night and left the kettle steady on the stove. He looked at her sleeping face with the map of their years etched there, and felt the impossibility of repair like heat in his throat. He made a decision then, savage and necessary. He took the little savings he had in the cigarette tin, a month's wages, and packed a bag. Mariam woke to find a note that said, simply, "I will not let it fall apart on my watch." He had written nothing to explain his absence beyond that, because explanations make places for argument, and he had none left to offer. Jacob fled, not because he feared physical harm nor the court of public opinion, as much as because he had decided that his family must survive somewhere without the aroma of scandal. He fled with Helen and the thin things that meant home: a small radio, a bundle of clothes, the school certificates Helen had made out of brown paper. He borrowed a van and drove away before dawn. He left windows half closed and a kettle that would cool under the morning sun. He left Mariam with a door that would not open easily again. Amanda watched him go from her library, palms on the windowsill, the city spread below like a map she had once thought she reigned over. She felt not triumph, but a small recoil. He had gone to keep his family. Perhaps, she thought, that was all a man could be expected to do. She wrote no letter, made no dramatic gesture. She allowed herself a private grief that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with consequence. She had wanted a child. Fate had given her a son or daughter that risked being raised without the man who had been its improbable companion. Her victory over Amaka had not filled the silence, it had only shifted it. Outside, the city woke, wheels biting tarmac, market sellers calling out the day's earliest bargains. Jacob drove with Helen asleep on the seat beside him, her face small and untroubled for now. Miriam watched him from the threshold, arms folded like a guard. They would find a new place, Jacob told himself. He had a hammer and a set of wrenches, and the stubbornness that makes men tack dreams to the walls of their lives. In the mansion, Amanda paced rooms with cool marble and warm emptiness. She walked past photographs where her younger self smiled dressed in corporate armor, the caption of a life that had been ordered and attained. Now there was a child within her, a secret that had the power to reconfigure loyalties. She had banished her sister, but in the quiet left behind, she learned that justice is not the same as relief. She thought of the kind of mother she wanted to be in the place where no one expected one at this age. Amaka sat in a one-room apartment with her sons and planned. She was furious, but fury can be a poor architect. She had lost access not only to money, but to the easy scripts of a life in which favors paid off later. Her sons shifted, uneasy with their bellies and their pride. Amaka watched the city with a new hunger. She would not be invisible. She swore it. Weeks passed like wet laundry. Jacob found a tucked-away workshop on the edge of a neighborhood where rent was kinder. He fixed cars and took in work that did not ask about paper or pedigree. Miriam kept their home together, with the steadfast attention of someone who knew the cost of giving up. She received word that Amanda had reasserted herself, that the network of the mansion tightened around a secret that would be kept. People said the driver had been dismissed, the staff rearranged, the house security doubled. Amanda's life continued in a hush. Then a letter came to Jacob, small and folded, with a single line inside: "I need you to come." The words were not entreaty, but arrangement. He knew the voice that had not yet hardened into command. He also knew the city's strange appetite for reunions. He went because the letter was from Amanda. He came because the child inside the woman had become a possibility that felt like a rod he could lean upon. He came because he wanted to see what kind of future a child between them would demand. When he arrived at the mansion, security let him through with the sort of polite suspicion that sits like varnish over officialdom. The house smelled of citrus and new wool. He felt suddenly like a thief who had come to an estate to steal back privilege. Amanda greeted him in the study, where the light landed in a cut that made the desks seem like altars. She looked different in that room, smaller and more uncertain, but also fiercely present. "You are here," she said. There was no accusation in it, only the fact of him standing in a place he'd come to know as a boarder. He had expected anger from outsiders, perhaps reproach. She reached for his hand, not as a lover, but as a co-conspirator in something neither of them could yet name. "There are people who would prefer this child not to exist," she said. "They will try to push it back into shadow." Jacob felt his stomach vote with fear and also with a strange resolve. He put his oil-stained hand in hers, and for a moment the room was only two people holding on. Outside, in a rented flat 3 streets away, Amaka watched the news feed that addressed the city's elite with the same indifference it did the rest. She had received a whisper from a friend, a piece of paper, a half-scribbled plan. The plan did not speak in violence, it spoke in leverage. It spoke in ways to make the mansion uncomfortable, to make the people there scramble. Revenge, in Amaka's mind, was not the same as murder. It would be pressure points, not poison. Yet in the human heat of her anger, plans can become rivers that overflow. Small actions tumbled into larger ones. A quiet warning left in Amanda's flower vase. A call to a solicitor with an anonymous tip. A nurse asked to be reallocated. The world can be rearranged by a series of soft knocks. Jacob found himself at a crossroads he could not see past. He had to decide whether to step into Amanda's life publicly, to put his family in the path of gossip, or to protect the solitude Mariam and Helen had fought so long to keep. The city watched him make decisions with the calm cruelty of its noise. Children ran in the street, the heat stayed like a palm on the back of his neck. The crisis of that morning came like a drumbeat. Someone in the mansion had been unkind enough to attempt harm again. It had failed. The household went into the kind of efficiency that takes the edges off panic and reshapes them into procedure. Amanda, for all her wealth, walked with the brittle gait of someone learning that isolation could be a target. She did not weep loudly. She closed off rooms and called lawyers. The board of friends who had once been mirrors turned to stone. Jacob felt the weight of suspicion more heavily than he had ever imagined. It was not just the eyes on him, it was the footprint his choices had left. He decided, in the end, that survival was not a private treasure. It was shared, messy, and sometimes impossible to keep clean. He could not be both the man who took gifts and the man who left his family. The city had no patience for contradictions. The decision to flee, to carry Helen away, and to let Mariam endure the aftermath became a quiet heroism he had not prepared for. When he finally left the compound the last time, with nothing but a satchel and a ticket for a bus, he looked at Amanda across the gate. She was alone, her silhouette framed by the courtyard's planted palms, the marble reflecting the sun like a reprimand. She did not call him back. She watched him go with an expression that was not exactly regretful. It was the face of someone who understood that power often demanded sacrifice. She had reclaimed control by exiling the one who had sought to take it, and yet what she had won made a hollow sound inside her chest. Jacob's engines ran like a hymn of escape. Helen slept against him with the simple trust of a child. The city unspooled behind them like a story with too many authors. Mariam watched from the doorway, a figure carved in the light of a house that had once been all of their life. She had been left to pick up the pieces as most women do, with steady hands and a heart that refused to break. Amaka's exile hardened into a plan that was no longer simply about money or envy. She found ways to shadow the mansion in the cracks of legitimacy, to gather information from vendors and drivers, to prod at the household seams. She began to believe that justice could be sculpted from the shards of annoyance and neglect. But someone who plots from bitterness often finds the line between pressure and harm thinner than they thought. Back in the mansion, Amanda stood by her window and watched the city stretch. She had the child inside her as a living question. What happens when two very different worlds collide and produce a life neither was meant to hold? She did not know. She only knew the immediate facts. The child was there. Jacob had gone. Amaka was gone. Her house had become a site of rumor. These were the bones of the story she would have to tend. When the message came to Jacob 3 nights later, it was a simple plea. Come back now, urgently. The line was short. The fear in the silence after the call told him more than any words could have. He returned not as a lover maligned, but as a man summoned to protect what he had helped create. The city seemed to lean in with him, listening. What he found when he arrived was a compound in disarray, but not yet defeated. Amanda stood at the end of a corridor that was bleeding into evening. Her cheeks were hollowed with sleeplessness. There were blue marks under her eyes like bruises from a very different fight. She told him, softly, that there had been another incident. The household suspected it had been deliberate. Her voice had the kind of steady that a storm develops before it breaks. Jacob felt the old habit of protection flare up. He had never wanted to be heroic. He had wanted a small, quiet life. But the situation demanded something broader. When Amaka's shadow crept again into their lives, the question was no longer about guilt between two people. It was about survival and agency in a city that judged quickly and forgot softly. The confrontation with Amaka, when it came, was not the melodrama of television. It was quiet and sharp and made of paper-thin slivers of fact. She came back to the edges of Amanda's world by way of a supplier who wanted money. She leaked rumors and waved them like flags. She presented herself as a hurt woman who had lost more than a roof. She wept at the edge of the compound, a plaintive, practiced sorrow. Amanda answered in the only way she knew, with a house emptied of an old affection. She called security and the lawyers and made a decision that felt, to some, like cruelty, and to others, like precision. Amaka's fortunes evaporated gradually, as if the city itself assumed she had been overripe and therefore disposable. On a humid night, with Lagos asleep under a thin white cloud, someone knocked at Jacob's temporary door. He opened it to find a man he knew only as a driver. The man spoke quickly and in the peculiar code of those who run errands for the wealthy. There had been a disturbance at the mansion. A nurse suspected foul play. Amanda had been admitted again. The man's eyes darted away when Jacob asked if she was safe. "No," he said. "They say she nearly—" He swallowed. Jacob crushed the keys in his palm and ran. The bus station smelled of oil and frying plantain. He moved with a speed that felt like repentance. He arrived at the hospital with a pulse in his throat and found the waiting room a semicircle of low-toned whispers. Amanda was there, pale and fragile, a person reduced to breath and numbers. The doctors used words that had no hunger. Stabilized, observation, no sign of deliberate harm found, but further tests advised. The staff moved in efficient circles and left the rest to fate. When the doctor spoke to him outside the curtained room, Jacob heard the word injury and was told to be calm. He was urged to wait and to expect procedure. He felt stupid for being calm in the way they meant. Amanda, at that moment, lay in a bed in a room made to be private. She turned her head and looked at him with the kind of fatigue that made people look like maps of their lives. "You came," she said, a sentence so small and so vast it could have been a vow. He sat down, and when he reached for her hand, he felt the thinness of life like a currency that could be spent quickly. "I am here," he said. Outside, the city breathed and did not care, and yet its noise was the most extravagant background to a small human scene. A woman, wealthy and at an age where society had given her a certainty about the shape of her life, lay fragile and unexpected in a hospital bed. A mechanic, oil-stained and ashamed, held her hand. A sister had been driven out. A wife waited back home with an emptied kettle and a heart as hard as flint. No one had yet spoken of the thing that must not be given a method. The attempt on Amanda's life hung about like a shadow, a thing that had been done and was not to be repeated. The hospital staff murmured about investigation. Jacob felt the old, ugly hand of guilt reach for him like a tentacle. He wanted to scream at the world for making choices as if life had rules about fairness. When Amanda finally sat up, she did not ask for money or laurel. She asked instead about custody, of what no one could say exactly. She asked about truth. She wanted those who had plotted against her to be found and removed. She wanted access to the kind of clarity that money sometimes bought and sometimes did not. She had won a kind of argument by banishing her sister, but she had not solved the problem of being unexpectedly human. Jacob realized then, in a way that was not rhetorical, that choices ripple in ways you do not expect. What he had wanted to be a private sin had become a public difficulty that threatened to swallow more than the two people entangled in it. He had meant to protect his family. Instead, his acts had set off a chain. He knew then that flight was a temporary oddity. There would come a morning when he would have to decide whether to return for good or to live in the shadow of what he had caused. Amanda's hands trembled when she took a paper the hospital staff gave her, a small list of precautions and warnings. The test results were ambiguous, but leaning toward the miraculous reality of an unexpected pregnancy at her age. It was not a miracle she would call divine. It was a medical anomaly that had the power to complicate every arrangement. She smiled one time, and for the first time in months, something like soft hope creased her face. But alongside that tenderness, there was iron. She would not be a victim. She would not be a joke. The city outside the hospital window glowed with neon and the slow thrum of life. Jacob watched her and thought of Helen and Miriam and of how children are sometimes carried into the world by decisions that adults make, like weather. He felt the sharp need to do right by those who loved him, though he did not yet know how to unlearn the compromises he had made. A message arrived on his phone from an unknown number. "There will be consequences if you leave her." The words were polite and menacing. Jacob folded the phone into his pocket and looked at Amanda. She had the look of someone who had been betrayed and yet was already planning steps forward. In his chest, the finality of decisions weighed like wet sand. He could imagine a life of small bravery with Miriam and Helen, of working until his hands wore down, of modest dignity. Or he could imagine the hazardous possibility of a child born into luxury and scandal, of a future that would always be a question. Whose name would the child carry? Which world would claim them? It was a terrible, intimate problem. When Jacob left the hospital into the humidity of evening, he felt exhausted in a way that was not simply physical. The city spread out before him, a tangle of possibility and consequence. He went back to the rented workshop and sat on a stool that had seen better days. He thought of the envelope he had accepted months ago at the roadside and how it had begun a story neither he nor Amanda had fully intended. He thought of Mariam's face in the morning light, resolved and hurt. He thought of Amaka, furious and deprived, now plotting like a storm. He felt the world narrow until the only question remaining was, what would he choose when the next door opened? The phone buzzed again. Another message. "Meet me tonight at the hotel by the bridge. There is something we need to discuss." The sender's name was not there, only the number. Jacob's thumb hovered over the screen. He could ignore it, and perhaps the matter would resolve in the tedious machinery of the legal and the affluent. Or he could go and find out what manner of person would push so close to anger as to issue threats in a city whose noise drowned most promises. He left anyway, because courage often smells like compulsion. The hotel was mid-range, a place that accepted cash and did not require references. He found a table in the dimmed bar and waited, watching the entrance. When the figure arrived, Jacob expected a conspirator or a hired hand. Instead, it was Amaka. She sat down opposite him with a cup of tea and the kind of composure that looks like victory. Her eyes were reddened from crying or from argument. He could not tell. He did not want to meet her gaze, and yet he was unable to look away. "You think you can run," she said, not as accusation, but as fact. "You walk away and leave your woman and your child. You think that solves anything?" Jacob's hands clenched in his lap. He had thought he had run from the problem. Now Amaka revealed that running had consequences he had not calculated. "I left to keep them safe," he said. "I left because your storms would have broken them." Amaka laughed, a hard, brittle sound, and it struck like a struck bell. "Safety is a story the rich tell the poor," she said. "You were never going to be safe in that mansion. You were a curiosity, a pet. Now you are a problem. Jacob felt the world tilt. He had misread her. She was not only the jealous sister, she was someone who measured worth in access, and who had been taught to claw for a place at the table when life refused to seat her. He realized with a deep and sudden clarity that the tensions were more complicated than love and duty. They were also about inheritance, entitlement, the way that being born to less changes the cost of every choice. Amaka slid a small envelope across the table, thin, unremarkable. "This will make sure you are quiet," she said. Jacob pushed it back. "I won't be bought," he said. She smiled, not with warmth, but with the knowledge of the city's markets. "You already were," she replied. "You have been bought many times, gift by gift. It is in your blood to barter, Jacob." He left the hotel with the envelope burning a hole in his pocket like a question that could not be answered. He carried it home, where the smallness of his life felt like a refuge and a judgment both. There would be no easy answer. The more he tried to do right, the more he found the world complicated by consequences he had not foreseen. That night, after Helen had been tucked into bed, and Mariam had gone to bed with a firmness that suggested a decision, Jacob sat on the step outside their rented room and stared at the sky. The city's light did not show stars. It made a glow that hung above the roofs like a promise and a lie. He thought of the child inside Amanda, and of how many people would claim it as a symbol of wealth, of scandal, of vindication. He thought of how many names could be given to the same small life. The moments before sleep are often the most honest. He felt the weight of what he had done and what he had not done. He had been selfish and brave and ashamed in different measures. He had also done what he could to keep a child fed and a wife clothed and a daughter in school. He did not know if any of it counted for good. At dawn he left again, the city a blur of horns and calls. He did not know that the next week would test him further than the last. He did not know that Amaka would escalate her plans in a way that would not be easy to stop. That fear, when it is sharp, cuts across reason and crowds other people's good intentions into corners. But he knew one thing with the unadorned clarity that grief and responsibility sometimes provide. He could not return to a life of safe lies. Something in the future demanded a decision that would be more than a furtive kindness at a roadside. It would be a public stance that might cost them everything. The phone vibrated once more. A name flashed, Amanda. The message read, "Come now. We have to speak about the child." He felt his stomach tighten and his hands go cold. He did not know yet whether the conversation would change course or merely rearrange the wreckage. He climbed into a taxi with Helen clinging to his hand and drove toward a city that seemed to be waiting on the breath of a single family to decide what it wanted to do next. The mansion loomed ahead across the river, an island of marble in a sea of dust. He thought of pockets and wallets, of the way money could buy instruments but not absolution. He thought of Amaka and Mariam and Helen, each in their private world of desire and fear. At the gate, a security man nodded, and Jacob stepped forward. The air inside the mansion was cooler, and for a moment he allowed himself to forget the day's complications and imagine a life where choices were easier. Amanda met him at the entrance with the quiet of one who had been up all night. "We have to be careful," she said. Her voice had the soft steel of someone who had been betrayed and had become more precise for it. He nodded. "I will do whatever it takes," he said. She looked at him with a look that was not quite trust and not quite accusation, more like a tally being balanced. As she turned to lead him through rooms that smelled of polish and citrus, Jacob saw a small thing on a side table, a photograph, framed and slightly cocked. It was him on a workbench months ago, caught by a guest at the mansion in a candid moment. He had a rag over his shoulder and a smile that belonged to a man who had once believed in the solidity of life. Outside, someone watched the mansion through the glass of a car window, a figure in a jacket with hands folded. The city's noise carried little clues in its wake, A rumor told to a friend, a whispered suspicion, a note left in a tray of food. The atmosphere around the mansion hummed like a wire awaiting touch. Inside, Amanda took Jacob's hand and guided him toward the study where the light pooled on the floor like a soft accusation. They would speak, she said. But as they sat, neither of them realized that the next act would stretch beyond their intentions, that choices made to protect might be read as betrayal, and that the cost of a child's life might be more than either could pay. The mansion took their words and held them. The city outside considered its hunger and waited for the next move in a story as old as survival. Those with little would always have to choose between ruin and flight. Those with much would always have to navigate the precariousness of being human. The two worlds would meet again, and when they did, the consequences would echo further than anyone could predict.